name is Kylie Davan, and I'm going to be talking to you today about our study to understand the public's attitudes and perspectives towards genetic biocontrol. So what is genetic biocontrol? Genetic biocontrol is any method that modifies an organism's genetic material in order to control an invasive species population. There is a growing interest among invasive species managers in genetic biocontrol because of the lack of success with traditional methods such as chemical treatments and physical removal to manage populations, as well as that genetic biocontrol could be more effective at controlling invasive species while having fewer non-target impacts. Given the likelihood of its use in the future, it is important to understand the public's perspectives towards genetic biocontrol, not only because the public's perceptions can impact the allocation of funding for research and development, but also because its success will largely depend on the public's support and acceptance. So before I talk about the public's perspectives on genetic biocontrol, it's important to understand how attitudes towards new technologies are formed. Attitudes are persisting judgments of concepts, issues, objects, or people. Attitudes are central in determining public support and acceptance towards new technologies. Attitudes towards new technologies are largely influenced by the benefits and risks people perceive of them. Generally, previous studies have found that those who perceive more risks will have more negative attitudes, while those who perceive more benefits will have more positive attitudes. In turn, people with positive attitudes tend to be more supportive of new technologies, while people with negative attitudes tend to be less supportive. Some studies have found that knowledge impacts support and attitudes towards new technologies. These studies generally find that people with more knowledge perceive greater benefits than risks and are more likely to be supportive of a new technology. Like with other emergent technologies, most people have little to no knowledge on genetic biocontrol. However, a lack of knowledge on new technologies does not prevent people from forming opinions. When people lack sufficient knowledge, they rely on other psychological factors to act as a heuristic or shortcut to guide their attitudes and opinions. Affect, or general feelings and emotions, is one such factor that enables people to make judgments on new and/or complex topics without extensive thought or knowledge. So with familiar topics, people can use the cognitive evaluations they have stored in their memory, such as those related to perceptions of usefulness, the benefits or the risks, along with stored affective evaluations to form their attitudes. However, with unfamiliar topics, people do not yet have these stored evaluations, and instead they rely on affect heuristics, such as the emotions they feel when they are first introduced to a new technology. If a person experiences negative emotions when they are first introduced to a new technology, they are more likely to perceive it as risky and have negative attitudes towards it. And if they experience positive emotions, then they are more likely to perceive it as beneficial and have positive attitudes. Given that many people do not have a lot of knowledge on genetic biocontrol, it is likely people will use affect heuristics to guide their attitudes and perceptions about it. Social trust, or a person's willingness to rely on institutions and experts involved in the development and management of technologies, is a significant factor shaping the public's support, attitudes, and risk-benefit perceptions of new technologies. Generally, people with higher levels of trust tend to be more supportive, have more positive attitudes, and perceive more benefits and fewer risks. In addition, trust in institutions and people involved can act as a heuristic and is particularly important in situations where people do not have sufficient knowledge about a new technology. Again, given the general lack of knowledge on genetic biocontrol, it is likely that people's levels of trust in the relevant institutions will impact their risk, benefit, and overall perceptions. There are several socio-demographic factors that have been found to affect attitudes and supports towards new technology. One factor is ideology. Several studies have observed that people who identify as more liberal usually perceive more benefits and are more supportive of new technologies than people who identify as more conservative. A number of studies have found that religiosity impacts support towards new technologies, with those who are more religious generally having less support for them. Research has consistently found that those who identify as a woman tend to perceive more risks and are less supportive of new technologies. And the last one I'm going to talk about is education. Education has been shown to impact attitudes towards new technologies, although the results are mixed regarding whether this impact is positive or negative. So next, I'm going to talk about factors specifically related to genetic technology that influence people's attitudes. So first, the application in which the genetic technology is going to be applied has been found to impact people's attitudes and support towards it. Generally, more supported applications include those for human health, agriculture, and environmental pollution remediation. While using technology for de-extinction, which is bringing back an extinct species, or to make aquarium fish glow, also known as glowfish, tend to have little support. The species the genetic technology will be used on also is the key influencing factor on people's support. People tend to find it more acceptable to use genetic technology on plants than they do on animals. Additionally, whether the species is native or non-native also impacts perceptions, with the use on non-native species garnering more support. However, not all non-native species are seen as equal to people, and perceptions about non-native species can vary. So digging into how these perceptions on invasive species can vary, many invasive species have been intentionally introduced for food, economic, aesthetic, and cultural reasons. Thus, people may object to the management of introduced species that they perceive as valuable or beneficial. Additionally, a species' physical characteristics can influence how people perceive them. People tend to have positive perceptions of species that are considered cute, charismatic, or aesthetically appealing. This may include species that are small and fluffy, large and majestic, or bright and colorful. The amount of time an invasive species has been present in an area can also influence people's perceptions. Generally, the longer an invasive species has been present, the more likely it is to be perceived as native and naturalized. And based on comments from our elicitation study, which you can see on the slide, people may perceive the common carp as naturalized to Minnesota because it has been present since the late 1800s, so quite a long time. So now that we have some background information on factors influencing attitudes and support towards new technologies and invasive species, I'm going to talk about what other studies have found on the public's perspectives of genetic biocontrol. These studies have found mixed support for genetic biocontrol, varying due to the factors that we just talked about. Potential benefits people have identified related to the use of genetic biocontrol are that it could be more effective with fewer non-target impacts. It could be used preemptively before a species gets out of hand and at a larger spatial scale. It could be cheaper than current methods, and it could be less labor intensive. However, many people in these studies are concerned about the potential unknown long-term effects, unintended consequences, and whether or not we'll be able to control the genetic biocontrol techniques once we put them out into the environment. Additionally, stakeholders are concerned about the public's acceptance of genetic biocontrol because it could be controversial. In a study by Sharp, 2014, stakeholders in the Great Lake regions generally believed the public would have negative perceptions of genetic biocontrol due to the public's negative response to GMOs, or genetically modified organisms. Stakeholders are also concerned because multiple studies have observed that some people have moral and ethical objections to the use of genetic biocontrol. So, our primary objective for this presentation is to examine the relationships among level of support, attitudes, benefit risk perceptions, and the other key influencing factors I talked about related to genetic biocontrol. In addition, we are interested in comparing how levels of support may differ based on our case species. Our case species are zebra mussels and common carp. These species negatively impact invasive water bodies by modifying the habitat structure. Zebra mussels through creating intricate structures when they form large groups that stick together, and through the accumulation of their shells. common carp by uprooting vegetation. They both alter the water clarity of an invaded water body, with zebra mussels making the water clearer, while common carp tend to make the water murkier. Both change the nutrient cycling and concentrations of invaded water bodies, and both impact species composition. They've also had costly economic impacts related to management and research costs, declines in state tourism and recreational fishing, as well as decline in property values that are near invaded water bodies. The current method most commonly used in Minnesota to control zebra mussels are chemical treatments, and for common carp, it's physical removal. These methods, however, are not always effective, can have non-target impacts, and be costly as well as time and labor intensive. Moving on to the methods. So first, our elicitation study in the spring of 2022, we conducted an elicitation study to verify that the questionnaire we developed from other studies represented Minnesotans' perspectives. We contacted a random sample of 588 individuals through email, and we used an online questionnaire that consisted of mostly open-ended questions and a few multiple-choice questions. For our primary study, we collected data this May through July using an online questionnaire. We sampled 27,000 residential addresses using a mail push-to-web design. So we sent them a letter with a link to the survey. 910 of these surveys were undeliverable, and 2,445 surveys were returned for a response rate of about 9.4%. Looking at response rate by a region, over half of our responses were from participants in the 7-county Twin Cities metropolitan area. This area consists of the counties Anoka, Carver, Dakota, Hennepin, Ramsey, Scott, and Washington. And you can see it's this circle and darker area towards the bottomish right of the state. And just under 40% were from the greater Minnesota area, which we consider all other counties. So I want to quickly discuss data weighting, which is a technique often used by researchers to correct for any sample imbalances. So as you may recall, over half of our survey responses came from people living in the 7-county Twin Cities metro area, or TCMA. After data cleaning, this percentage was just under 60%. However, the TCMA only accounts for about 55% of Minnesota's total population. Thus, we have an overrepresentation of people from the TCMA. To correct for this, we need to weigh the data. So to do so, we first take the population proportion, or the proportion of Minnesota's population that lives in the TCMA, and we divide it by the sample proportion, which is the proportion of responses that we got from the TCMA. We then take this number, which is 0.923, and we multiply it by the number of observations that we had to find the weighted number of the new weighted observations. So we got 1,403 observations, we multiply it by our weight, which gives us 1,295. And then to double check our work, we can see that this weighted sample now matches the TCMA's population proportion. So we weighted the data by region, sex, age, and education. Again, the regions are on the right. We did this using data from the 2021 American Community Survey 5-year estimates, which provides county-level data on age, sex, and education. And to quickly summarize the questions that are pertinent to this presentation from our questionnaire. So we measured support by asking participants how much they support or oppose genetic biocontrol, as well as other management methods. Attitudes were measured by asking participants how much they feel that genetic biocontrol is harmful or beneficial, foolish or wise, and bad or good. Benefit and risk perception were measured in 2 ways. First, participants were asked how much they agree or disagree to 9 statements that were developed from the results of our elicitation study, as well as previous research. And then second, we asked participants whether or not they believe the benefits to far or slightly outweigh the risks? Vice versa, so do the risks far or slightly outweigh the benefits, or are they about the same? And it's the second question about the benefits or risks outweighing each other that I will use for the results. We measured knowledge by asking participants before we gave them any information on what genetic biocontrol is, how knowledgeable they felt they were on genetic technology towards AIS, or aquatic invasive species. Effect was measured by asking participants to what extent they feel various emotions when they think about genetic biocontrol. We measured trust by asking participants the extent they trust or distrust various entities to develop and implement genetic biocontrol. Ideology was measured by asking participants to what extent they identify as a liberal, conservative, if they do at all. Religiosity was measured by asking participants how important religion is in their life. We measured sex by asking participants how they would describe themselves. And lastly, we measured education by asking people what is the highest level of education they have completed. So moving on to the preliminary results. For the preliminary results, I'll be focusing on support and the factors influencing support. This study does have a message framing component that is beyond the scope of this presentation. However, I do want to note that only the responses of those who saw the control frame, so they did not see any information about the benefits or risks, they just received a basic definition of what genetic biocontrol is, are used for the preliminary results for this presentation. And the results for this presentation include 1,623 responses. Looking at support for various management methods, the most supported management method was physical removal for all scenarios and species. We asked them about AIS in general, zebra mussels, and common carp. And this was followed by genetic biocontrol. So still pretty well supported, but not the highest. The least supported method was introducing a disease or pathogen. A pair t-test indicates that people have significantly higher support for using genetic biocontrol on zebra mussels than on common carp or AIS in general. And then they also have higher support for using genetic biocontrol on common carp than they do for just AIS in general. So it goes zebra mussels as the top, common carp, then AIS. Looking at attitudes, people generally had positive attitudes towards genetic biocontrol. And based off previous studies, we expect that those negative attitudes will have lower support, and those with positive attitudes will have higher support. As we expected, attitudes were found to be strongly positively correlated with support, indicating that as attitudes increase or become more positive, people's level of support increases. Most perceive the benefits of genetic biocontrol to slightly or far outweigh the risks. We expect that people who perceive more risks will have lower support, and those who perceive more benefits will have higher support. However, unlike what we expected, we found that perceiving more benefits than risks is strongly negatively correlated with support, meaning that the more someone believes the benefits outweigh the risks, the less they support genetic biocontrol. And this result is confusing and becomes even more confusing when looking at a two-way table of support for genetic biocontrol, which is on the left side of the table, and risk versus benefits variable, which is at the top of the table. So this table shows that the majority of those who said the risks outweigh the benefits opposed genetic biocontrol, while those who said the benefits outweigh the risks supported genetic biocontrol, which is what we had originally thought would happen. Yet despite this seemingly positive relationship, support and risk-benefit perceptions had a negative correlation. More analysis is needed to understand why we got this result. Looking at knowledge, most respondents said they were not at all to slightly knowledgeable about genetic biocontrol. We expect that those who lack knowledge on genetic biocontrol will be less supportive, while those who have more knowledge on it will be more supportive. And we found that level of self-perceived knowledge has a very weak positive correlation with support of genetic biocontrol, so corroborating our expectations. Looking at effect, the highest ranked negative emotion people felt about genetic biocontrol was worry, followed by fear. While for positive emotions, most said they felt hopeful, followed by trust. Based on the literature, we expect that feeling negative emotions will lead to less support, and feeling positive emotions will lead to more support. As we expected, we found negative emotions were moderately negatively correlated to support, meaning the more someone felt a negative emotion, the lower their support was. And positive emotions had a moderate to strong positive correlation with support. Thus, the stronger someone felt a positive emotion, the higher their support was. For trust, the most trusted entity involved in genetic biocontrol research and development was scientists working at a university, while the least trusted is federal government agencies. We expect that those with lower levels of trust will have less support, and those with higher levels of trust will have more support. And as we expected, we found that trust had a moderate to strong positive correlation to support, indicating that those with higher levels of trust are more supportive of using genetic biocontrol. Looking at ideology, more participants indicated that they were liberal to some degree than conservative or neither. We expect, based on prior research, that those who are more conservative will have lower levels of support, while those who lean more liberal will have higher levels of support. And as we expected, we found ideology is correlated to support, and as ideology increases, meaning as people become more conservative, their support decreases. Religion is important to many respondents. We expect that as religiosity increases, i.e. religion becomes more important, support will decrease. And we found that religiosity is negatively correlated with support, although this relationship is very weak. Our participants, mostly more participants identified as a man than a woman. Based on other studies, we hypothesized that those who identify as a woman will have lower levels of support, and those who identify as a man will have higher levels of support. And we found mixed results. For AIS in general, identifying as a woman was negatively correlated with support. So if you identified as a woman, you are more likely to have less support. And this corroborates what we expected. However, sex was not significant for zebra mussels and common carp, which contradicts what we expected a little bit. So more analysis is needed to further understand why AIS is significant, but zebra mussels and common carp are not. Lastly, our sample is pretty well educated, with just under half having their associate's degree or higher. We expect that those with higher levels of education will also have higher levels of support. And we found that, again, mixed results. Education was significantly correlated with support for genetic biocontrol to manage common carp, although this relationship is very weak. And so we need some more analysis, again, to tease out why there was a difference between AIS and zebra mussels, but it was correlated for common carp. So to quickly discuss what we found, most participants were supportive of using genetic biocontrol, and their level of support differed depending on the species. This highlights that people may not be supportive of all genetic biocontrol initiatives or applications, and that engagement should be done for every species that genetic biocontrol will be applied to. And then similar to previous studies, we found that people's level of support for genetic biocontrol may be influenced by attitudes, benefit-risk perceptions, knowledge, effect, trust, ideology, religiosity, sex, and education. More analysis, though, is needed to understand the relationships between support and benefit-risk perceptions, sex, and education. Related to benefit-risk perceptions, my main question for analysis will be whether the relationship between support and the risk versus benefit spiral we saw is the same for the 9 benefit-risk statements. And related to sex and education, more analysis is needed to understand why only one of the three case species or scenarios was correlated with them, but not the others. These are my literature cited. And do we have any questions?
Thanks so much, Kiley, for that presentation. Yeah, if you have any questions for Kiley, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And I can get us going with a couple of questions. So one question we have here is, how stable or malleable are these attitudes and risk perceptions likely to be?
So attitudes are generally considered more stable over time than, say, emotions. It's hard to tell right now for genetic biocontrol how stable they will be over time, only because it's so new to people that a lot of people don't have a lot of knowledge about it. Sometimes knowledge can change people's attitudes, right? They learn more about it and they say, oh, it's not so bad, or it's worse than I thought, you know? But other times it doesn't change people's attitudes. They'll just find a way for it to support what they already felt. So it's really hard to tell, and it's hard to compare it to other technologies as well.
And just to introduce myself, I'm David Fulton, and I'm working with Kiley on this project. And one thing that we should mention is Kiley has some data where she did provide information, positive information, balanced positive and negative information. And we're just really beginning to tease out some of the results of that. So that might really help us understand how information might shift where attitudes are at, or how stable those attitudes might be, even with providing information. So stay tuned. We'll have more data coming out on that portion of the study as well.
Thanks, David. And we have a question here from an attendee. They say, how will any decision be made to use any specific genetic biocontrol technique for any specific species?
I will note that we are several years away from any potential genetic biocontrol being used. And by several, I would say like 5 to 10 years, although that is not my field of expertise. There's a lot of regulatory and legal processes that it will have to go to before it is applied. And I think it will be by a state-by-state basis. I can't speak to the specifics of what it would have to go through, but these methods are still in the early stages of development. So they're still being developed in a lab. They need to be tested and then go through the process of public engagement and then what legal and other things that will need to be done. So I would say it's something that we have many years to think about what that process should look like. And it's something people are already talking about too. So our researchers are already wondering, okay, in case like these methods are great and we develop them, what do we need to do to make sure these go, like to pick species and then to get them through fairly and make sure we do all the safety checks and stuff before releasing them.
Yeah, thank you for that. So we have another question here. What seems key in explaining the differences or similarity of attitudes and risk perceptions?
You repeat that last part?
Yeah, sure. What seems to be the key in explaining the differences or similarities of attitudes and risk perceptions in genetic biocontrol?
Yeah, so risk perceptions largely, along with benefit perceptions, are what largely influence people's attitudes, right? So they'll say, they'll weigh the benefits and risks, and based off that, decide whether they think it's positive or negative. For instance, like getting in a car. There's benefit and risks that we weigh, maybe consciously, maybe subconsciously, before we decide if we're going to drive, or before we decide like if driving is an okay method of transportation, just to give a basic example. So with emergent technologies, there has been some similarities in the risks and attitudes between, say, like other genetic technology applications. But as far as like nanotechnology, a lot of the underlying factors, so like attitude formation is similar, but people's attitudes may differ between nanotechnology and genetic biocontrol, just as they might differ between, GMOs in their food versus genetic biocontrol. They're really specific to a topic or an area, while risks are what help determine their attitudes. I hope that answers your question.
We've got one more question here. What are the next steps for this project?
So the next steps for this project, especially for my portion as the grad student, will be a more rigorous analysis to get into those relationships a bit more. A correlation is a nice simple analysis just to get an idea of the relationships, but I plan to do a structured equation model on the different factors influencing support. And then as well as analyzing that message framing component that David talked about that was just beyond the scope of this presentation. And then from there, we hope that it will inform decision makers on just how the people of Minnesota feel. And so those are the next steps, especially that analysis is the next like real soon steps. So
thank you. We have another question here from an attendee. There are a range of different genetic biocontrol strategies, for example, RNAi or CRISPR-based gene editing. Did your study examine whether specific technologies are more or less favorable?
So our study did not, but it is something we're interested in. Because this is one of the first studies to quantitatively research what the Minnesota public feels, we decided to go with that more broad genetic biocontrol, right? Just get those broad attitudes, broad feelings towards it. But we do understand that, those differences in technologies can mean different attitudes, different levels of support. And there's some studies, especially out of like Australia, that have started to look at those, like what different techniques are people okay with? Like, are they okay with adding a gene from a different species or just editing a gene from the same species? Those types of things. So that would definitely be like a future research that I think needs to be done and is really important, especially depending on where genetic biocontrol, like the methods that are being researched right now, go. We just decided for this study to do a more broad view and then get into those specifics later on. So hopefully those will happen, as well as it gives a chance for the researchers who are developing these techniques to kind of progress. So we can say, okay, RNAi is a more likely one that will happen, and maybe CRISPR is not. So we do understand there are differences, and we hope to research them at some point in the future.
Thank you so much for that. Again, if anybody has any questions, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and you can ask them anonymously if that feels more comfortable to you. And we can wait a few more minutes to see if any questions come in.
You can also email me if you have any questions after the presentation at davan015@umn.edu. If you can't think of it now, but then later today you're like, oh, I should have asked that, feel free to send me an email. I'd be happy to chat with you about it.